What's the darkest secret your family forced you to keep? I was 12 years old when my father made me help him bury the money in our backyard. It was past midnight on a Wednesday in July, and the summer heat hadn't broken even though the sun had been down for hours. My father's face glistened with sweat as he dug, the shovel making soft, thudding sounds as it hit the dirt. He'd woken me by shaking my shoulder hard, his breath smelling like whiskey and something metallic I couldn't identify. "Get dressed," he'd said. "Don't wake your sister, don't make a sound." I pulled on jeans and a shirt, my hands shaking as I tied my shoes. My mother stood in the kitchen doorway as we passed, her arms crossed, her face expressionless. She didn't try to stop us. She never tried to stop anything my father did. The backyard was dark, except for the porch light my father had turned on, casting long shadows across the grass. He'd already dug a hole about 3 feet deep near the back fence, behind my mother's neglected rose bushes. A large duffel bag sat next to the hole, canvas sides bulging with whatever was inside. My father grabbed it and dropped it into the hole with a heavy thud that made the ground vibrate under my feet. "Start filling it in," my father ordered, handing me a second shovel he'd leaned against the fence. His voice was low and urgent, eyes darting toward the neighboring houses like he expected someone to appear at any moment. I took the shovel, the wooden handle rough against my palms, and started pushing dirt back into the hole. The bag disappeared quickly under the soil, and with each shovelful, my father's shoulders seemed to relax slightly. When we finished, he stomped down the loose earth, then scattered some dead leaves and twigs over the disturbed ground. "You never saw this," he said, gripping my shoulder so hard it hurt. "You were asleep all night. You don't know anything about any money. If anyone asks, if the police come, if your teachers ask, if anyone in this whole goddamn world asks, you don't know anything. You understand me?" I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. "Say it," he demanded, his fingers digging deeper into my shoulder. "I don't know anything," I whispered. "I was asleep all night." He studied my face for a long moment, then released me. "Good boy. Now go back to bed and forget this happened." But I couldn't forget. I lay awake the rest of that night, staring at my ceiling, trying to understand what had just happened. Money didn't need to be buried in the middle of the night unless something was wrong with it. Money that was earned legally went in banks, not in duffel bags, in holes in the ground. The next morning at breakfast, my father was cheerful, making jokes and asking my younger sister Meredith about her summer camp plans. My mother made pancakes and smiled when he kissed her cheek, like the previous night had never happened. I pushed food around my plate, exhausted and confused, and when my father looked at me, I saw the warning in his eyes. "Don't tell. Never tell." The secret settled into my chest like a stone, heavy and cold. Over the following weeks, I found myself staring out at the backyard, at the patch of ground behind the rose bushes that now looked exactly like all the other patches of ground. My father had been so careful, so methodical. This wasn't the first time he'd done something like this. That realization made my stomach turn. How many other secrets were buried in places I didn't know about? My father was a contractor who owned his own business, Fletcher Construction. He built custom homes for wealthy clients in our suburb outside Chicago, and from the outside, our family looked successful and normal. We lived in a nice house, drove decent cars, took vacations to Florida every winter, but there were things that didn't add up, even to my 12-year-old understanding. My father always dealt in cash whenever possible. He had multiple cell phones that would ring at odd hours, calls he'd take in his truck or out in the yard where no one could hear. Sometimes men would come to our house late at night, sitting in our kitchen with my father while my mother took Meredith and me upstairs, telling us to stay in our rooms no matter what we heard. I'd press my ear to my bedroom door, catching fragments of conversation, numbers that seemed too large, mentions of the inspector and off the books and under the table. Once, I heard my father say, "I'm not worried about the IRS. I'm worried about Castellano finding out we skimmed." The name Castellano made the other men go quiet, and then they lowered their voices even more, so I couldn't hear what came next. School started in late August, and I tried to focus on 7th grade, on normal things like homework and soccer practice and the girl in my English class who smiled at me sometimes. But the secret was always there, a constant weight I carried. At night, I'd dream about the backyard, about the ground opening up to reveal not just one bag but dozens, hundreds, an endless pit of buried things that should have been brought into the light. One Saturday in September, I was mowing the lawn when I accidentally ran the mower over the burial spot. The ground had settled slightly, creating a small depression that the mower's wheel caught in, causing me to stumble. My father was working on his truck in the driveway and saw me hesitate, saw me staring at that spot. He was beside me in seconds, taking the mower handle from my hands. "Careful," he said quietly. "Ground's uneven there, probably an old gopher hole or something." His eyes held mine, and I saw the message clearly. Even thinking about it too much was dangerous. I nodded and stepped back, letting him finish that section of the lawn. My hands were shaking as I went inside for water, and my mother was at the kitchen sink, washing vegetables for dinner. She glanced at me, then out the window at my father. "Your father works hard for this family," she said softly. "Everything he does is to give you and Meredith a good life. Remember that." The way she said it made it clear this wasn't just a casual observation. This was instruction, preparation. She was telling me that loyalty to the family meant protecting my father's secrets, no matter what those secrets were or what they might mean. I drank my water and went upstairs, feeling sick. In October, 2 police detectives came to our house. I was doing homework at the kitchen table when the doorbell rang, and I watched through the window as my mother answered. The detectives showed her badges, and her face went very still, very careful. She invited them in, offered them coffee, they declined, and called my father in from the garage where he'd been working. They all sat in our living room while I stayed frozen at the kitchen table, barely breathing. I couldn't hear everything they said, but I caught enough. They were asking about one of my father's construction projects, about materials that had been ordered but never used, about payments to subcontractors who didn't seem to exist. My father's voice was calm and cooperative, explaining that he'd have to check his records, that his bookkeeper handled most of that he ran a legitimate business and was happy to help with whatever they needed. The detectives asked if they could look around, and my father said they'd need a warrant for that, politely but firmly. After they left, my father stood at the front window, watching their car drive away. Then he turned to my mother and said, "Call Richie. Tell him it's happening." My mother picked up the phone immediately, her fingers steady as she dialed. My father noticed me sitting at the table and walked over, pulling out a chair and sitting across from me. His face was serious, but not angry. "You remember what I told you this summer? About not knowing anything?" I nodded, my heart hammering. "It's more important now than ever. Those detectives might try to talk to you. At school, maybe, or they might come back here. They might make it sound casual, like they're just curious. They might make it sound like telling them things will help me, help the family, but anything you tell them will be used against me. You understand? They're not your friends. They're not trying to help. They're trying to build a case." He leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "So what do you know?" "Nothing," I said, my voice barely audible. "I don't know anything." "That's right. You're a kid. You go to school, you play soccer, you do your homework. You don't know anything about my business. You've never seen anything unusual. Right?" "Right," I whispered. He reached across and squeezed my hand, and there was genuine warmth in the gesture, which somehow made it worse. "I know this is hard, buddy. I know you're scared, but you're part of this family, and families protect each other. Everything I've done, everything I do, it's for you and your sister. To give you opportunities I never had. You believe that, right?" I wanted to believe it. Part of me did believe it. He was my father, and he'd taught me to ride a bike and helped me with my math homework and came to every one of my soccer games. But another part of me, growing larger every day, knew that what he was asking me to do was wrong. That whatever was buried in our backyard was connected to something illegal, maybe something dangerous. The detectives didn't come to my school, but the investigation continued. My father's business partner, a man named Richie Santoro, was arrested in November on charges of tax evasion and fraud. The local news covered it, and I watched from my bedroom as my mother quickly changed the channel when Meredith came into the room. My father spent more time on his phone, more nights in meetings with men who came to our house and spoke in low voices behind closed doors. The tension in our house was like a physical presence, pressing down on everything. In December, my father came home one afternoon and told my mother to pack bags for all of us. "We're taking a trip," he said. "Family vacation. We leave tonight." My mother's face went pale, but she nodded and started moving immediately, pulling suitcases from the closet. Meredith was excited, asking where we were going, talking about beaches and Disney World. But I saw the way my father kept looking out the windows, the way his hand kept going to his pocket where he kept his phone. This wasn't a vacation. This was running. We made it as far as the Indiana border before my father's phone rang. He answered it, listened for a moment, then his face went gray. He pulled off at the next exit and turned the car around without explanation. When we got home, there were 2 black SUVs in our driveway. FBI agents were waiting, and they had a warrant this time. They searched our house for 6 hours, going through every room, every closet, every drawer. They took my father's computer, boxes of files from his home office, and they brought ground-penetrating radar equipment into our backyard. I watched from my bedroom window as they scanned the area behind the rose bushes, as the equipment beeped and showed them exactly where to dig. They found the bag. I wasn't allowed outside, but I could see them lifting it out of the hole, see the way the agents' faces changed as they opened it and saw what was inside. It wasn't just money. There were documents too, files, ledgers, things that apparently told a story my father had been trying to bury. The lead agent came inside and read my father his rights, while my mother stood in the kitchen doorway, crying silently. Meredith was at a friend's house, spared from seeing this, but I witnessed everything. Before they led him out in handcuffs, my father looked at me. His face was a mixture of anger and resignation, and something that might have been regret. "Remember what I told you," he said. The agent pushed him toward the door, but my father twisted around, pulling against their grip. "You don't know anything!" he shouted at me. "You were asleep! You never saw anything!" The words echoed through our house as they took him away, and I stood there shaking, my mother's sobs filling the silence he left behind. That night, an FBI agent named Special Agent Kimberly Oakes came back to our house and sat down with my mother and me at the kitchen table. She was in her 40s, with short dark hair and a direct gaze that made me feel like she could see straight through any lie I might tell. "I know this is difficult," Agent Oaks said, her voice professional but not unkind, "but I need to ask you both some questions about Mr. Fletcher's activities. Anything you can tell us might help us understand the full scope of what he was involved in." My mother's face was pale and puffy from crying, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "I don't know anything about my husband's business dealings. I'm a homemaker. I take care of the children and the house. Whatever Carl did at work, he never discussed it with me." Agent Oaks turned to me. "What about you, son? Did you ever see your father bring money home, hide things, meet with people at unusual times?" The moment crystallized in my mind, sharp and clear. I could tell her about the burial, about being woken up in the middle of the night, about the duffel bag and my father's threats to keep silent. I could tell her about the men who came to our house, about the phone calls I'd overheard, about everything I'd seen and heard over the past months. This was my chance to tell the truth, to let someone else carry the weight of this secret. But I looked at my mother's face, saw the plea in her eyes, and I thought about Meredith, only 9 years old, who still believed our father was a hero. I thought about what would happen to our family if I talked. "I don't know anything," I heard myself say. The words came out automatically, programmed by months of my father's warnings. "I'm just a kid. I go to school and play soccer. I don't know about my dad's business." Agent Oaks studied me for a long moment, and I could tell she didn't believe me. "You're sure? Because if you know something, and you don't tell us, that's obstruction. That's a crime, even for a minor. And if you're lying to protect your father, it won't help him. The evidence we found in your backyard tells us everything we need to know about what he was doing. But if you were forced to be part of it, if he made you do things, you won't be in trouble for that. We need to know the truth." The truth. Such a simple phrase for something so complicated. The truth was that my father had woken me up and made me an accomplice to burying evidence. The truth was that I'd been living with this secret for months, carrying it like a poison that was slowly killing something inside me. But the truth was also that he was still my father, and my mother was sitting next to me barely holding herself together, and my sister was at a friend's house still believing everything was fine. "I was asleep," I said, looking Agent Oaks in the eyes and lying directly to a federal agent. "I don't know anything about anything." After Agent Oaks left, my mother hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. "Good boy," she whispered. "You did the right thing. You protected your family." But I didn't feel like I'd done the right thing. I felt like I'd just stepped over a line I could never step back across. The next few months were a nightmare of lawyers and court dates and media attention. My father was charged with embezzlement, tax fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. The story came out in pieces through news reports and legal filings. My father had been skimming money from his construction projects for years, working with his partner Richie, and a man named Anthony Castellano, who turned out to be a local organized crime figure. They'd been inflating costs, creating fake subcontractors, taking bribes from inspectors, and hiding millions of dollars from the IRS. The bag in our backyard contained nearly $300,000 in cash, plus ledgers, documenting years of illegal transactions. My father's lawyer tried to build a defense, but the evidence was overwhelming. The trial was scheduled for the following summer, and in the meantime, my father was released on bail with an electronic ankle monitor. He came home, but it wasn't the same home anymore. The house felt different with my father back in it. He was angry constantly, snapping at my mother over small things, barely speaking to Meredith and me except to remind us that we didn't know anything, that if anyone asked questions, we were to say nothing. The ankle monitor beeped periodically, a constant reminder of his restrictions. He couldn't leave the house except for legal appointments and medical emergencies, couldn't work, couldn't do anything except wait for his trial while our family fell apart around him. My mother got a job at a department store, her first job in 15 years. Because my father's assets had been frozen and we needed money for basic expenses, the house went into foreclosure. My father's lawyer bills were astronomical. Every day brought new financial disasters. At school, everyone knew who I was now. The son of the criminal contractor, the kid whose father had stolen millions. Some students avoided me, others asked invasive questions, and a few seemed to think it was exciting or cool in some twisted way. I kept my head down, tried to be invisible, and counted the days until summer when I could at least avoid the constant scrutiny of classrooms and hallways. One evening in late March, my father's partner Richie came to our house, ignoring the conditions of his own bail that said he wasn't supposed to contact my father. They argued in the kitchen while my mother sent Meredith and me upstairs, but I could hear them shouting. "You said you'd take care of this," Richie yelled. "You said if we buried the evidence, they'd never be able to prove anything. They had fucking ground radar," my father shouted back. "How was I supposed to know they'd bring that kind of equipment? You're the one who kept sloppy books." "My books were fine. This is on you, Carl. You're the one who got greedy, who took more than his share." The argument escalated until I heard furniture scraping, like someone had been shoved against the table. My mother's voice cut through, high and frightened, telling them to stop. Then sudden silence, footsteps, and the sound of the front door slamming. I looked out my window and saw Richie getting into his car, saw the way his hands gripped the steering wheel before he drove away. The next morning, Richie was found dead in his car, parked at a construction site on the north side of the city. Single gunshot to the head. Weapon never recovered. The police investigated it as a suicide, said he'd been depressed about his upcoming trial, but I knew better. I'd heard him fighting with my father, heard him blaming my father for everything. Someone had killed him, and whether it was my father, or someone my father had hired, or someone like Castellano who wanted to keep Richie from testifying, I didn't know. But I knew it wasn't suicide. Agent Oakes came to our house the day after Richie's death. She sat down with my father in our living room, my mother and his lawyer present, and asked him directly where he'd been the previous night. My father's ankle monitor confirmed he'd been home all night, never left the property. But you could have made a phone call, Agent Oakes said. You could have arranged it. I don't know what you're talking about, my father said calmly. Richie was my partner and my friend. His death is a tragedy. If you're suggesting I had something to do with it, you're way off base. Agent Oakes looked at him with open contempt. Your friend, right. The friend you were arguing with last night. The friend who was about to testify against you in exchange for a reduced sentence. Very convenient that he's dead now, my father's lawyer interrupted, saying this was harassment, and unless they were charging his client with something, this interview was over. Agent Oakes stood up, but before she left, she looked around our living room at my mother and me sitting frozen on the couch. Does anyone in this family ever tell the truth? She asked. Or are you all just going to keep lying until you're all in prison or in the ground? Nobody answered. After she left, my father turned to me. You see what happens? You see what they're trying to do? They want to turn us against each other. Divide and conquer, that's their game. But we're stronger than that. We're a family. We protect each other. Right, buddy? I nodded mechanically, but something had broken inside me with Richie's death. Before, I could tell myself that my father was just a criminal who cheated on taxes and stole money. White-collar crime. Something almost abstract. But now someone was dead, and whether my father pulled the trigger or just made a phone call, the result was the same. A man was dead because of the secrets we were keeping. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Richie, about how scared he must have been in those last moments, about whether he'd seen it coming. I thought about my father's face when Agent Oakes accused him, how calm he'd been, how controlled. I thought about all the secrets piled up on top of each other, crushing down on me until I could barely breathe. Around 2 a.m., I got out of bed and went downstairs for water. My father was in the kitchen, sitting in the dark, drinking whiskey from a glass. The ankle monitor glowed faintly on his ankle, a small red light blinking every few seconds. He looked up when I came in, and for a moment, we just stared at each other. Can't sleep? He asked. I shook my head, getting a glass from the cupboard and filling it at the sink. My hands were shaking. Me neither, he said. Lot on my mind. He gestured to the chair across from him, and reluctantly, I sat down. You're scared of me now, he said. It wasn't a question. I didn't answer, which was answer enough. My father took a drink, the ice in his glass clicking softly. I never wanted you to see this side of things. I wanted to keep you clean. You and your sister both. That's why I tried to keep you out of it. You made me help you bury the evidence, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. You woke me up and made me part of it. I know, and I'm sorry about that. I really am. But I was in a panic, and I needed help, and you were there. I thought I was protecting you by showing you how to handle dangerous situations. I thought I was teaching you to be strong. He set down his glass and leaned forward. Everything I did for this family, to give you advantages, to make sure you'd never struggle like I did growing up. Maybe I crossed some lines. Maybe I made mistakes, but I'm still your father. That means something, doesn't it? Did you kill Richie? The question came out before I could stop it, hanging in the dark kitchen between us. My father's face went very still. No, I didn't kill Richie. I don't know who did, but it wasn't me. You believe that, right? I wanted to believe him, but I'd been believing him for months, believing that everything was fine, that the secrets were necessary, that loyalty to family meant protecting criminals. I don't know what to believe anymore, I said, standing up. I don't know who you are. I went back upstairs before he could respond, and I lay in bed staring at my ceiling until morning light crept through my window. Something had shifted in me that night. I couldn't keep carrying these secrets, couldn't keep lying to protect a man I was increasingly afraid of. The trial began in early June, just after school let out for summer. The courthouse was downtown, a big imposing building with metal detectors and security guards. My mother made Meredith and me come to the opening statements, said it was important for the jury to see that my father had a family who supported him. We sat in the gallery behind the defense table, and I watched as the prosecution laid out their case. They had the money, the ledgers, the testimony from subcontractors who'd been pressured to lie on invoices. They had bank records showing the flow of illegal payments. They had cooperating witnesses who explained how the scheme worked, how my father and Richie had been operating for at least 7 years. The evidence was overwhelming and damning. My father's lawyer tried to create reasonable doubt, suggesting that Richie had been the mastermind, and my father had been manipulated, but even I could tell the jury wasn't buying it. They looked at my father with disgust, and when the prosecution showed photos of families who'd been scammed, who'd paid for materials and work they never received, the jury's disgust deepened. During a recess, I went to the bathroom and found Agent Oakes washing her hands at the sink. She saw me in the mirror and turned around. "How are you holding up?" she asked. Fine, I said automatically. No, you're not. Nobody in your situation is fine. She dried her hands and leaned against the counter. It's not too late, to tell the truth. You're a minor, and you were coerced. If you come forward now, admit what your father made you do, it could help you process this, help you move forward. I stood there in that courthouse bathroom, the sounds of water dripping and voices echoing from the hallway, and I felt the weight of the secret pressing down harder than ever. What would happen to my mom and sister if I testified? I asked. If I told everyone what I saw? Agent Oaks considered the question carefully. Honestly, your mom would probably face charges for aiding and abetting if we could prove she knew what was happening. Your sister is young enough she'd be protected, but your family, as you know it, would be destroyed. Then again, looking at your face right now, I'd say your family is already destroyed. The only question is whether you're going to keep drowning in your father's sins or save yourself. Before I could respond, my mother appeared in the doorway. Her face went hard when she saw me talking to Agent Oaks. We need to get back to the courtroom, she said, coldly. Now. I followed her out, feeling Agent Oaks watching us go. My mother gripped my arm as we walked down the hallway. What did she say to you? What did you tell her? Nothing. I didn't tell her anything. You better not have. You understand what's at stake here? If your father goes to prison, we lose everything. The house is already gone. We have nothing. If you testify against him, if you break this family apart, I will never forgive you. Never. Her words were like ice, and I realized in that moment that she cared more about the money, about the lifestyle, about maintaining appearances, than she cared about what was right or wrong. She'd known what my father was doing all along. She'd benefited from it, spent the money, enjoyed the fruits of his crimes. She was just as guilty as he was, maybe more so because she'd hidden behind the role of innocent homemaker while enabling everything. The trial continued for 3 weeks. Witness after witness testified about my father's crimes. The prosecution built an airtight case. My father's lawyer did his best, but there was nothing to work with. The evidence was too strong. Then, in the final week, the prosecution called a surprise witness, Anthony Castellano, the organized crime figure my father had worked with. Castellano had been arrested on unrelated charges and had agreed to cooperate with authorities in exchange for a reduced sentence. He took the stand and calmly explained how my father had approached him years ago, looking for ways to launder money from his construction scams, how they'd developed a relationship, how my father had paid a percentage to Castellano in exchange for protection and connections to corrupt officials. And then Castellano said something that made my blood run cold. Carl Fletcher was worried his partner was going to flip, Richie Santoro. He asked me if I could take care of the problem. I told him I could for a price. He paid me $50,000 cash, and I had Richie taken care of. Made it look like suicide. The courtroom erupted. My father's lawyer objected frantically, arguing that this was hearsay and prejudicial. The judge called for order, but the damage was done. The jury had heard a confession that my father had ordered a murder. My father sat at the defense table, his face ashen, and when he turned to look back at my mother, I saw pure terror in his eyes. During the next recess, my father's lawyer argued furiously to the judge that Castellano's testimony should be stricken, that it was part of a separate investigation and shouldn't be allowed in this trial. The judge ruled that since it directly related to my father's criminal enterprise and demonstrated consciousness of guilt, it was admissible. The jury would be allowed to consider it. That evening, back at the small apartment we'd moved to after losing our house, my mother was hysterical. He killed someone, she kept saying, pacing the living room. He ordered a hit like he was some kind of mob boss. I didn't know. I swear to God, I didn't know he'd gone that far. But I wondered if that was true. I wondered what else she'd known and chosen to ignore. Meredith was in her room with the door closed, and I could hear her crying. She was old enough now to understand some of what was happening, to know that our father wasn't the man we'd thought he was. I sat on the couch, numb, trying to process the revelation. My father had killed someone, had paid to have someone murdered, and I'd helped him bury the evidence that had started this whole investigation. I'd helped him, and then I'd lied to protect him, and now someone was dead. The next day, before the trial resumed, Agent Oaks approached me outside the courthouse. You heard what Castellano said yesterday. Your father is going down for a long time, regardless of whether you testify or not. But you could still do the right thing. Come clean about what he made you do. Stop carrying his guilt. I looked at her, this woman who'd been trying for months to get me to tell the truth, and I finally understood that she wasn't my enemy. She was trying to save me. If I testify, what happens to me? I asked. Nothing. You were a minor, coerced by a parent. You'd be protected. We might set you up with a counselor, help you process everything, but you wouldn't face charges. And my mom? That depends on what she knew, and when she knew it. But honestly, son, do you really want to keep protecting someone who's been lying to you and using you to protect a murderer? I thought about my mother's face when she'd warned me not to talk to Agent Oaks, about how she'd cared more about money and status than about right and wrong. I thought about my sister, who deserved better than to grow up believing lies were acceptable if they protected family. I want to testify, I said. Agent Oaks's face flooded with relief. Are you sure? Once you start, there's no going back. I'm sure. I'm done keeping secrets. She took me to a conference room where a prosecutor named David Winters was waiting. He explained what would happen, how I'd be called to the stand, what questions I'd be asked. He assured me I'd be treated gently, that they understood I was a victim in this situation. My mother found out I was talking to the prosecution, and she burst into the conference room, furious. "What are you doing? What have you told them?" "The truth," I said, standing up to face her. "I told them the truth about the night Dad made me help him bury the evidence. About everything." Her face went white, then red with anger. "You little traitor. After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us? By destroying your own father?" "He destroyed himself," I shouted back, all the months of fear and guilt and anger finally exploding out of me. "He's a criminal and a murderer, and I'm not going to lie for him anymore. I'm done being part of this." My mother slapped me across the face, the sound echoing in the small conference room. Agent Oakes stepped between us immediately, pulling my mother back. "Mrs. Fletcher, you need to leave now, or I'll have you arrested for assault." My mother looked at me with pure hatred. "You're no son of mine. From this moment on, you're dead to me. Dead. You understand?" I touched my stinging cheek and nodded. "Fine. I'd rather be dead to you than be like you." Security escorted her out, her screaming echoing down the hallway. Agent Oakes put a hand on my shoulder. "You did the right thing. It's going to be hard, but you did the right thing." That afternoon, I took the stand. The courtroom was packed, and I could feel everyone watching me as I was sworn in and sat down in the witness box. The prosecutor asked me to state my name for the record, and my voice shook as I answered. Then he began asking questions. "Do you know why you're here today?" "Yes, to tell the truth about what my father made me do." "And what was that?" I took a deep breath and looked directly at the jury. "In July of last year, my father woke me up in the middle of the night and made me help him bury money and documents in our backyard. He told me I could never tell anyone, that if the police asked, I was supposed to say I was asleep and didn't know anything. I told them everything. About being woken up, about the duffel bag, about filling in the hole while my father kept looking over his shoulder at the neighboring houses, about his threats, his warnings that telling anyone would destroy our family, about the months of carrying that secret, of lying to teachers and police and federal agents because I was terrified of what would happen if I told the truth, about watching Richie die and knowing it was connected to my father's crimes. The courtroom was completely silent as I spoke, and when I finished, I felt lighter than I had in months, like I'd finally put down a weight that had been crushing me. The prosecutor thanked me and sat down. Then my father's lawyer stood up for cross-examination. He was a man in his 60s named Richard Grayson, and he looked at me with barely concealed disdain as he approached the witness stand. "You love your father, don't you?" he asked. "I used to," I said honestly, before I found out what he really was. "But you're a child who's been under tremendous stress, whose family is falling apart. Isn't it possible you've confused dreams with reality? That you've created memories that didn't actually happen?" "No, it happened exactly like I said." "But you waited months to tell anyone? If it really happened, why didn't you speak up immediately?" "Because I was scared. Because my father threatened me. Because I thought I was protecting my family." Grayson moved closer. "Or because it never happened, and now you're making up a story to get attention, to punish your father for disappointing you." I looked past Grayson to where my father sat at the defense table. He was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Sadness and anger and resignation all mixed together. I'm not making anything up. He woke me up that night and made me help him, and then he made me lie about it for months. And I'm done lying. Grayson tried a few more questions, but I stuck to my story because it was the truth. Finally, he gave up and sat down. The judge dismissed me from the stand, and as I walked past my father's table, he leaned over and whispered, "I hope you can live with what you've done." I stopped and looked down at him. "I hope you can live with what you've done. You killed someone. You made me an accomplice. You destroyed our family. Not me. You." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. My father showed no emotion as the verdicts were read, just sat there staring straight ahead while his lawyer put a hand on his shoulder. Sentencing was scheduled for 6 weeks later. In the meantime, my father's bail was revoked, and he was taken into custody immediately. As they led him out in handcuffs, he didn't look at me. My mother was waiting outside the courtroom, and when she saw me, she turned and walked away without a word. I watched her go, knowing I'd never see her again. She'd meant what she said about me being dead to her. Agent Oakes drove me to the apartment where Meredith was waiting with a social worker. My mother had abandoned her there when she went to the courthouse, and now neither parent was available to take care of us. The social worker explained that we'd be going into foster care temporarily while they figured out permanent arrangements. Meredith cried when she saw me, running over and hugging me tight. "What's happening? Where's Mom and Dad?" "Dad's in jail," I said gently. "And Mom left. But we're going to be okay. I promise we're going to be okay." I don't know if I believed that, but I needed her to believe it. The social worker, a kind woman named Patricia Liu, took us to a foster home that evening. It was in a suburb north of the city, a neat ranch house where an older couple named the Abbotts took in kids who needed temporary placement. The Abbotts were patient and understanding, never pushing us to talk about what had happened, but making it clear we were safe with them. Over the following weeks, I went to therapy sessions with a counselor who specialized in trauma. She helped me understand that I wasn't responsible for my father's crimes, that protecting myself and telling the truth didn't make me a traitor. Meredith had her own therapist, and slowly, she started to process what had happened to our family. Our mother never contacted us. Agent Oaks checked in regularly, making sure we were doing okay. She told me that my testimony had been crucial, that it had sealed my father's fate, and also demonstrated the kind of psychological control he'd exerted over his own child. "You saved yourself," she said during one of her visits. "A lot of kids in your situation never find the courage to break free. You should be proud of that." At the sentencing hearing in August, I sat in the gallery with the Abbotts while my father stood before the judge. The prosecutor recommended 30 years for the financial crimes and the murder conspiracy. My father's lawyer argued for leniency, painting my father as a man who'd made terrible mistakes but deserved a chance at redemption. The judge listened to both sides, then delivered her ruling. "Mr. Fletcher, you ran a criminal enterprise that defrauded innocent people of millions of dollars. You corrupted officials, manipulated systems, and when your partner Howe threatened to expose you, you had him killed. Worse, you involved your own child in your crimes, threatening him into silence and traumatizing him in ways that will likely affect him for the rest of his life." She paused, looking down at my father with no sympathy. "The law allows me to show mercy, but I see no reason to show mercy to someone who showed none to his victims, or even to his own son. I'm sentencing you to 40 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for at least 25 years. In addition, you'll face separate murder charges in state court for your role in Richard Santoro's death. Take him away." My father finally showed emotion then, his face crumpling as he realized he'd spend the rest of his life behind bars. He looked back at the gallery, searching for my mother who wasn't there, and then his eyes found me. We stared at each other across the courtroom, and I saw him mouth two words: "I'm sorry." I don't know if he was sorry for what he'd done, or sorry he'd been caught, or sorry he'd involved me. Maybe all three. But it didn't matter anymore. The apology couldn't undo the damage, couldn't bring back Richie, couldn't erase the months I'd spent carrying his secrets. As they led him away, I felt the last thread connecting me to him finally snap. He wasn't my father anymore. He was just a criminal being taken to prison. My mother was eventually tracked down in Arizona, where she'd fled with what little money she could access. She was arrested and charged with aiding and abetting an accessory after the fact. She took a plea deal and served 3 years. She never reached out to Meredith or me, never tried to explain or apologize. As far as she was concerned, we'd betrayed the family, and that was unforgivable. Meredith and I stayed with the Abbotts for 2 years, while permanent guardianship was arranged. Eventually, my father's sister, Aunt Linda, who lived in Oregon and hadn't spoken to my father in a decade because she'd seen what he was becoming, petitioned for custody. She'd cut ties with him years ago, disgusted by his choices, and now she wanted to give us a stable home. The court approved, and we moved to Oregon, where Linda and her husband Frank helped us rebuild our lives. They were good people, honest people, and slowly, Meredith and I learned what normal family life was supposed to look like. I finished high school, went to college, majored in criminal justice with the idea that maybe I could help other kids in situations like the one I'd been in. Agent Oaks wrote me a letter of recommendation when I applied to graduate school, and we stayed in touch over the years. "You're proof that speaking the truth matters," she told me once. "That standing up against corruption and abuse, even when it's in your own family, is possible. Never doubt that what you did was right." 10 years after my father's sentencing, I visited him in prison once. I was 23, working as a victim's advocate in Chicago, and something in me needed to see him, to close that chapter completely. He'd aged badly, hair completely gray, face lined and weathered. We sat across from each other in the visiting room, separated by a plexiglass barrier, speaking through phones. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said. His voice was rough, older. "I wasn't sure I would either," I admitted. "But I needed to see you, needed to understand if you ever really got what you did to us." He was quiet for a long moment, the background noise of the prison filling the silence between us. "I destroyed everything," he finally said. "Everything I told myself I was building for you and your sister. I destroyed it all. And I took your childhood with it. I'm sorry doesn't begin to cover it, but I am. I'm sorry." "Did you know?" I asked. "When you woke me up that night and made me help you bury the evidence, did you know you were crossing a line you couldn't come back from? Did you know you were going to lose us?" "I knew I was scared. I knew I needed help. I told myself it was just that one time, that I was protecting you by showing you how to handle crisis situations. But yeah, deep down, I knew what I was doing. I was making you complicit so you'd have to protect me. I was using you, and I've spent every day of the last 10 years hating myself for it." We talked for another 20 minutes, about Meredith, who was now in college studying to be a teacher, about Aunt Linda and Uncle Frank, about my work. He seemed genuinely interested, genuinely proud even, though he had no right to feel pride in who I'd become. As visiting time ended, he leaned closer to the glass. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it, but I want you to know that watching you testify, watching you refuse to be dragged down with me, that was the moment I realized I'd raised at least one thing right. You had the strength to do what was right even when it was hard, even when it cost you everything. I never had that strength." I hung up the phone and stood up, ready to leave. He pressed his hand against the glass, and after a moment, I pressed mine against it from the other side. Not forgiveness, but acknowledgement. Then I walked out of that prison and back into my life, free of secrets, free of guilt, free of the weight I'd carried for so long. Meredith and I built good lives, created our own definition of family based on trust and honesty, rather than blind loyalty and hidden crimes. The darkness our father had forced us to carry didn't define us. We defined ourselves, and we chose the light. 25 years after I'd helped bury that duffel bag in our backyard, I stood in a courtroom again, this time as a witness in someone else's trial, helping a teenager who'd been coerced into covering up his own father's crimes. As I testified about my experience, about the psychology of family secrets and the courage it takes to break free, I saw that same terror and determination in the kid's eyes that I'd felt on the stand all those years ago. After the hearing, the kid approached me, his foster mother beside him. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for showing me it's possible to survive this." "More than survive," I told him. "You can thrive. You can build something better. The secret they forced you to keep doesn't have to be your story. You get to write what comes next." He nodded, and I saw hope flicker in his eyes where there'd only been fear before. That's what breaking the silence does. It transforms victims into survivors, survivors into advocates, and darkness into light. My father died in prison 2 years ago, and I didn't attend the funeral, but I've spent my life making sure his crimes, his choices, his secrets don't define who I became. I chose truth, and that choice, hard as it was, saved my life. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.